Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled, Learn How to Reduce Your Risk of Bed Bugs. Our presenter is Dr. Joelle Olson. Dr. Olson is an entomologist and staff scientist at Ecolab with over 15 years background and experience conducting research on bed bugs. She works closely with the Ecolab research and development teams to develop new technologies and programs for the Ecolab Pest Elimination Division. Please ask any questions throughout using the Q&A feature in WebEx. Now I will turn it over to Dr. Olson.
All right. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm excited to share some information about a topic that I'm very passionate about. So for today's agenda, I'm going to cover off on some bedbug trends, what we're seeing out there in the market today, and then I'll talk a little bit more about biology behavior, give you a bedbug 101, so to speak, and then talk about ways that you can be proactive at your facilities and with your teams. And we'll talk a little bit about inspection tools, current control practices, and then some best practices that you can take home to your team as well. So let's just get started with some of the trends we're seeing today. So I'd like to start off and talk about bedbug activity and where we see that most often occurring throughout the year. What's interesting is that bedbugs are not considered a seasonal pest, meaning they don't come from outdoors, they don't come inside when the conditions outdoors are not if it's too hot or too cold. So they're not associated with a seasonal pest activity like we normally see. They're actually associated with people alone. So they're coming in on people's personal belongings. But what's interesting is that we actually do see peaks and valleys throughout the year when activity is most prevalent. So if you see on the graph here, we see activity spiking generally in the later summer months. August, September, October is really when we see most of the bedbug calls coming into Ecolab for services and requests. So this is actually a perfect time to really start focusing on bedbugs right now with sitting in this webinar today, but also training your staff with some of the materials that we can provide. So some of the U.S. trends that we see is that nearly 80% of Americans are concerned about bedbugs today. So early on, maybe 10, 15 years ago, people really thought bedbugs were just a myth, something that you hear about, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite. But today, there's really been a shift, and the general public has become much more savvy on this topic. So 80% of people are aware of bedbugs, 25% of them are checking their rooms. This is based on a study that was recently conducted. I will say, though, that even though 25% of people are checking their rooms, not everybody is actually aware of what a bedbug looks like. So they may be checking their rooms, they may be coming up with different pests that look like bedbugs. So it's really important that you and your staff are aware of what bedbugs look like and what to do about them. And that's what we're going to talk about more today. Another issue out there is social media. So with social media, of course, there's so much information out there being posted. Some of it's true, some of it's not true. Whether it's true or not, though, it can be very damaging to your brand. So again, it's really important to make sure that you're taking steps to be proactive about bedbugs. There's no way to actually prevent bedbug activity, but there are definitely some ways you can be proactive, and we'll talk more about that today. An interesting study here that's on the slide that was conducted was that bedbugs, and even a single report about bedbugs can actually impact the value of a guest room. So from a hospitality or lodging standpoint, can actually reduce the rate of your rooms by up to $38 per room per night. So just to follow up on that, some of the ways that bedbugs can really impact your business is they can have that negative effect to your brand. If somebody has encountered a bedbug in a room that they're staying or within an apartment complex, and then they're upset about that situation, they may post it on social media, which can escalate very quickly and causing reduced RevPAR, it can really impact your bottom line when you've got people on social media posting things. And probably one of the most things that's really increased lately around bedbugs is litigation. And so, in fact, even though bedbugs have not been proven to be vectors of disease, they can actually impact human health and have longer-term effects on people that if they get upset about it, this can actually lead to litigation cases. And so when that happens, it's really important to make sure that you are working with your staff, you've got everyone trained on the subject, you're doing everything you can to be proactive, and you're treating bed bugs appropriately, and that means working really closely with a pest management provider. All right, let's switch gears, talk a little bit about biology behavior. So what are bed bugs? Bed bugs are nocturnal human parasites. They're actually also considered a nest parasite. They live in and around the nest of their host. And so for us, for humans and people, that is around the bed area or areas where people are sitting or resting for long periods of time. They feed exclusively on blood, and they prefer human blood, but immediately after feeding, they will go back into cracks and crevices around the sleeping or resting area of their host. They're light tan in color, but they do turn dark reddish brown once they've fed. And bed bugs often feed at night when it's dark and it's quiet. I've got 3 to 5 a.m. on the slide here, and that's just generally where we see the peak activity occur. But just if it's dark, it's quiet, the host is resting, that's when they come out and they feed. As I mentioned, they prefer to stay near their host. So that could be around the bed area, that could be around a sofa area, around a chair area, or a seating area. And they can travel pretty far. When they are searching and they're in host finding, searching modes, they can travel pretty far from one area to another, and that's really where we see bedbug activity, the possibility that it can spread to adjacent rooms. And as I mentioned, bedbugs have not been shown to transmit disease. Even though they're blood-feeding organisms, the way that they are physiologically designed is that they're just not capable of transmitting, or they haven't been shown to transmit disease from feeding on one infected host from another. All right, so with bedbugs, all life stages are visible. The eggs actually resemble little tiny pieces of rice. You can see those in the upper right-hand photo on the screen there. They don't lay their eggs in clusters or in an egg case. They actually lay them singly, but they will lay them next to each other or grouped together. The early nymphal stages, as you can see, the first instar on that picture of the penny there, that's the one that hatches out of the egg stage. And they actually go through 5 nymphal instar stages before they become an adult. And in between each of those stages, they have to feed, molt, feed, molt, feed, molt. They do that 5 times before they become the adults. In the adult stage, they do require a blood meal before mating and reproducing the eggs. And so this entire life cycle can be completed in as short as 6 weeks' time, but it can also take longer depending on the temperature and conditions. Females can lay up to 500 eggs in their lifetime, so their reproductive potential is quite high once they get started. All right, so what do they do? I mentioned they're nocturnal, they're night-feeding organisms. They're attracted to body heat. They're also attracted to elevated levels of CO2 and some of the secretions that people have on their skin. Bites are painless. They're often in rows or in a line or sometimes clustered together on the upper portions of the body. But unfortunately, even though those are all characteristic signs of bedbug bites, there's no way to actually diagnose a bedbug bite versus something else. So with people in general, people can have a variety of reactions to insect bites, to insect allergies, or even just irritations to detergents that were used to wash linens. And so unfortunately, there's no way to diagnose a bedbug bite just by looking at it. And so that's why it's really critical, again, that if you have a suspected case within your property or facility, to make sure that you're partnering with a pest management provider that can offer you that expertise and identification and provide an inspection and documentation in that room. All right, so where do bedbugs come from? They don't fly, they don't jump, they crawl from place to place, but most likely we consider them hitchhikers. So they come in on guests' personal belongings or new tenants that might be checking in or renting an area within your facility. So they come in on personal belongings. Also, another mode of transport could be used or stored furniture. So something to think about if you have a situation where bedbugs were on a piece of furniture, whether it be a headboard or a chair, and that chair goes into storage for an extended period of time. The interesting thing about bedbugs is that they can live very long times between feeding. So as I mentioned, they only feed on blood, and they can go up to 6 months without feeding. So just storing furniture that might have bedbug activity on it as a means to eliminated is not a sufficient process. Nymphs are very light in weight, as you saw in the picture in the slide a couple slides earlier. They're very lightweight, and so sometimes if an item or an article or a piece of furniture is set down or placed on a bed or thrown on a bed, and there's little first instars inside those items, they could actually become slightly airborne and then land in some of those areas where they're going to set up new harborage areas. So it's just very important to make sure that if bedbug activity is suspected, that we have a thorough inspection completed to look for those stages as well. And then, as I mentioned, bedbugs move around quite a bit, so if the infestation becomes larger, the chances of them spreading to adjacent areas is very high. All right, so let's talk about ways that we can be proactive. Probably the main biggest point I want to make here is that maintaining a well-trained staff, that's going to be the most important thing. That's your first line of defense. And so making sure that even if your staff just knows what a bedbug is, what to look for, what the signs are, and where to look. They can be conducting their regular routine services in a room or an apartment complex or in a assisted living facility. They can be conducting all their regular services, but as long as they know just what to look for while they're doing their routine services, if they notice signs of activity, they can go ahead and report it at that time. So maintaining a well-trained staff is number one. Another thing that I've seen occurring out there is some facilities have been providing incentives to their staff. This has been a way that has encouraged their staff not only to just know what to look for, where to look, but maybe even go above and beyond and really searching for that activity, which, again, if your housekeeping staff or your facilities staff or someone who's in the community is able to find bed bugs before a guest or a tenant, that's really going to help out a lot, even with just managing that situation, as well as controlling it before it becomes too widespread. And then lastly, you want to make sure you have an action plan in place. So if a bed bug is found in a room or in an area, that your staff knows what are the exact steps to take as far as what to do with that room, what to do with that tenant or that guest, and then how to follow up with treatment and protocols. Another proactive thing to do is reduce harborage areas. So we can't stop bed bugs from coming in, but we can stop them from, once they are introduced, to finding areas that they can hide. So vacuuming is a good practice in just making sure that the area is clean and there isn't a lot of extra debris around. Inspecting incoming furniture, so anything that's brought in on site, especially for apartments or extended stay or long-term stay or healthcare facilities. When you've got new tenants coming in with their furniture and all their belongings, it might be a good best practice just to have a process in place where you're inspecting those items, or you have someone on your staff that can inspect those items before bringing them into the room. And then, again, reducing those harborage areas. So pasting or replacing loose wallpaper, sealing any cracks and crevices. Those are the areas where bed bugs are going to look to harbor. So they're really good at hiding. So there is an old saying, snug as a bug in a rug, that actually comes from the fact that bed bugs back in the day were really able to put themselves into the tight cracks and crevices in a rug and stay hidden. And so if there's any ways that we can minimize carpeting, cracks and crevices along the wall boards, any areas where they can hide, it will help make the problem more visible, which then you can take action sooner rather than waiting until they grow, they spread, and they become out of control. All right, so when training your staff, there's a couple of key things you want to train them to look for. So blood spots on linens would be a clear sign, or at least a sign that you should investigate further. Bed bugs themselves on mattress seams or in box springs, bed skirts, any signs of the bed bugs themselves. As I mentioned, they hide very well, but you want to be looking for the life stages that we showed on the slide earlier. But I would say this last bullet point here is actually probably the most important one. So this is, even though the bugs hide themselves very well, the signs they leave behind are very obvious. So that would be the fecal spotting and the cast skins. So you can see in the pictures below here on the bottom left, that is actually a cluster of bed bugs, and you see all the little black spots around them. That's the digested blood meal. Immediately after feeding, bed bugs will excrete 70% of that blood meal, and so that is a very clear sign and indicator that if you see little spots like that, you might want to look a little bit further and see if there's bed bug activity as well. So you know what to look for, but where to look. So we've conducted quite a few studies at Ecolab to try to understand where bed bugs are setting up their harborage areas, and it really depends on the furniture and the decor in the room. But all that aside, we found that there's some key spots here that you want to consider inspecting on a regular basis. That would be the box spring, which includes the bed frame and the bed skirt as well, and also around the mattress area. The headboard is another hot spot, nightstands, and the carpet edge behind the bed. What's interesting is that, as I mentioned here on the slide, 75 to 90% of the population will be in and around the bed area. This is typical for hotel rooms, and specifically in hotel rooms, we see most of that activity on the box spring, bed frame, and bed skirt. It's a very different scenario when you're considering long-term care or assisted living facilities or more residential type situations where you actually see more activity on the mattress. And so this has to do with the fact that generally in hotels, the linens are being changed on a regular basis, which drives the activity to go a little further away from the host, whereas in a residential setting, if they feel like they're safe on the mattress area, they'll stay there. So around the ribbing, the label, the tag of the mattress is some of those key spots. Also, in a more residential setting, you want to be considering items like chairs, sofas, anywhere where the person being affected by the bed bugs, wherever they're spending most of their time, is generally where they're going to be. All right, so there are some, as I mentioned, you can't be preventative about bed bugs, but you can be proactive. And so some of the processes to be proactive, there are options out there for proactive inspection and treatment. And so in order to do this, you'll want to partner with a pest provider that has a program in place that can talk to you and your staff about the program and the benefits of that. But I will say in general, it includes a cursory inspection and treatment of key harborage areas of where those bed bugs are going to be harboring, as I talked about on the previous slide. And really, it's meant to stop the onesie-twosies that get introduced before they have the opportunity to establish and spread. So it's not a treatment program. It is not preventative. It will not stop bed bugs from coming in. It won't stop all bed bug activity in general, but it will have an impact on stopping some of those introductions from becoming established and spreading. And it can be a very good program to help reduce your overall risk of bed bug activity. It does require some customer partnership as well, and that would require getting access to rooms, prepping rooms, and again, that can all be worked out with your pest management provider. All right, so we talked about ways to be proactive, but if bed bugs are suspected, so this gets to that developing an action plan. If bed bugs are suspected, there are a few steps that we would recommend putting into place. Some of those would include leaving any items that were brought in the room. So leave the linens, leave the vacuum, if you bring in a housekeeping cart or any other objects with you. If there's bed bug activity suspected, leave everything in the room and then prevent access, almost quarantining the area. Basically, you want to close the room, don't rent the room, don't allow anyone in the room until it's been inspected by a pest provider. Notify your hotel management, call your pest provider, and then an inspection of not only the area that's suspected of activity, but your pest provider may also ask for access to the adjacent areas as well. Because as I talked about earlier, bed bugs can migrate and move quite a bit from one room to another. And sometimes when we get a call to come in and inspect a room, we actually find that the primary infestation is the room next door. And so again, that's why it's important to do a full inspection of all those adjacent areas as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the different inspection tools that are being used out there in the industry today. The first one would be visual inspection. So this is where you're partnering with a pest provider that is trained and has experience, especially in bed bugs. They're going to know what to look for, where to look, especially knowing that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of rooms have different decor, different setups, different headboard styles, bed styles. Just working with somebody who's experienced in bed bugs and knows exactly kind of where those bed bugs are going to go based on the decor in that room is really important. It's also important to have that documentation by a pest provider. Having someone on your staff that's knowledgeable and understands when it's a bed bug versus an ant is all very critical and important. But from a liability standpoint, it's important to have a pest provider that can come in and provide an inspection and documentation that has been done. So something to keep in mind as well. And as I mentioned, from a visual inspection, just use a flashlight. A flashlight alone is going to illuminate those areas where bed bugs are going to be hiding. And as I showed on those slides earlier, if you know what to look for, especially those little black spots or the cast skins, the fecal matter, those are all very obvious signs of bed bug activity that is not hidden very well like the bugs themselves. So knowing what to look for, having a good tool like a flashlight. Some people ask me about UV flashlights. I would say that UV flashlights will help illuminate the evidence a little bit more, but it's not necessary. Just a general flashlight and a well-trained person can do a full inspection. Another inspection tool is canines. So canines have been used for many, many years for different services as an inspection tool for narcotics or explosives. And no surprise here, dogs can be trained to detect bed bugs. Bed bugs emit specific chemical compounds that dogs can be trained to identify. The only challenge is that sometimes with canine detection with bed bugs is that the accuracy rate varies quite a bit, and it really depends on airflow, temperature, humidity, the environmental conditions, the location of where those bed bugs are, but most importantly, the training and the handler relationship. So there are certification programs out there and some best practices associated with training canines on how to detect bed bugs, but if you're not training them in the environment that they're going to be used in, they become a little less accurate on their ability to be able to detect bed bugs. And what I mean by that is there was a study done where bed bugs were hidden in PVC pipes in someone's garage. Canine walked by, they were 95% accurate at detecting those bugs. However, a study by Rutgers University showed that accuracy rate in the field actually varies more, somewhere between 10 and 100% accurate with an average of 44% accurate, and that was over 14 different companies that offered canine services. So while it can be effective, it varies highly. It requires ongoing, sometimes daily training of the canines in the field and the environment that they're going to be worked on. And just to point out, this is just like visual inspection. This is an inspection tool only, and further investigation and treatment may be required if bed bugs are found. Another inspection tool is monitoring devices. So there's just a few examples on the slide here, but there are actually a lot of different monitoring devices out there today. Some of them use heat, CO2, and pheromones to attract bed bugs into those traps. Some of them just utilize the fact that bed bugs move around and they passively may interact with that trap and fall into it. Those are called pitfall traps, and they're just meant to target wandering or host-seeking bed bugs as they're crawling around in the room. An example of that would be the one on the top right, in which it looks like a round dish where the bed bug crawls in as they're trying to get access to the leg of the bed there. They fall in the trap and they can't get back out. Same thing with the other round circular black colored one there as well. Those don't use attraction or attractive lures. They just passively catch the bed bugs as they interact with them. The other ones that are on the slide here are using different ways of different attractants, which if you're using a lure or an attractant, it does require replacement every so often, as that lure will become ineffective over time. One of the other things to consider is that these type of traps require quite a bit of maintenance. It's one thing to have a trap to detect bed bugs, and that's great, but if you're not inspecting the trap or you don't have someone dedicated on your staff to inspect that trap and clean that trap on a regular basis, it will become an ineffective tool. Where I see these tools as adding some benefit could be in more residential type situations where it could be used as a follow-up device, a follow-up to a treatment program, just to ensure that bedbug activity has been eliminated, or if there's been a sighting of bedbug activity and you want a trap in place to see short-term after that sighting if things have been eliminated or no longer present. In general, though, with any of these traps, nothing is quite as attractive as a human itself in a room. So these traps can be an additional tool to use, but it will not solve all the problems, of course. All right, let's talk about ways to solve the problem. So there are different treatment options that are out there, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. First one I'm going to start with is chemical applications. So first off, I want to say that there's been a lot of hype in the media a few years back and more recently as well that bedbugs are resistant to chemicals and that chemical products don't work. And when in fact those reports are based on individual studies of individual products. And yes, bedbugs have been shown to be resistant to some active ingredients, but there are several active ingredients out there and available. There are several formulations of products. And so chemical applications do work. In fact, they're a necessity as part of a treatment program. I would say even with heat treatments, which I'm going to talk about next, if you're going to be using any type of heat treatment, you want to be also using that in combination with chemical applications as well. Chemical applications are important, but the type of product used is most important. So again, you want to make sure you're working with a pest provider that understands the products that are out there and available, and make sure that they're not just using a single active ingredient, a single formulation, or even you may see some of these do-it-yourself products available on the shelf for bed bugs, but most often those products are contact kill only, meaning that you can spray it on the bug and it will kill the bug. But immediately after that product dries, it's ineffective. And so working with your pest management provider, they will have access to products that have what we call residual properties, where if you spray a surface or an area, that product will dry and it still has pesticide activity over longer term. So it has residual properties and a way to add a protective barrier or a protective application of a product to an area that bed bugs will come in contact with eventually. So it's very important to use these type of products. I will say with any type of chemical applications, it's important to have follow-up treatments as well. So generally, follow-up treatments should occur anytime between 7 and 14 days. The egg stage of bed bugs, they hatch in 7 to 10 days, and so that's why we recommend a follow-up treatment 7 to 14 days after the initial treatment. All right, with treatment options, let's talk about whole room heat treatment. So this is a situation where equipment can be brought in on site, as you see in the picture here. You can have a large heater, fans, strategically placed around the room to help circulate that heat, and then elevating the temperatures within that room to those areas and to those temperatures that are lethal to bed bugs. And so we found that temperatures above 122 degrees Fahrenheit will kill all life stages of bed bugs. But with this type of treatment, it's really important to make sure that you're getting consistent heat circulation and that you're avoiding any potential cold spots. So what I mean by that is there's some challenges with using this type of treatment in that if you have inconsistent heat distribution and you have a cold spot, bed bugs will actually seek and look for those cold spots in order to survive. And so with any of these type of treatments, again, it's important to work with a pest provider that has a lot of experience in this area, because with different room styles, different room layouts, different style furniture, decor, it's important for them to understand and have that experience to know how to minimize any potential cold spots. And again, as I mentioned before, any type of treatment that uses heat treatment should be combining that with a chemical treatment as well to help avoid, again, any areas that might be missed or unable to penetrate the heat into all those cracks and crevices. Another method of using heat treatment would be enclosed heat. So this is where there are several types of chambers that are out there in which the furniture can be moved inside the chamber. So this is a way to help minimize those cracks and crevices or areas where you are generating cold spots when you're talking about doing something like whole room heat. You can actually get everything inside of this chamber, elevate it to those lethal temperature zones. It's a way to contain the furniture, so rather than having the potential of bedbug activity spreading or searching for cold spots, you're containing everything inside that chamber and treating it at lethal temperatures. But with this type of treatment, again, no different than whole room heat treatment, you want to make sure you're combining that with chemical treatment as well. So this is a method to treat infested furniture, but then the rest of the area would need to be treated in a traditional chemical application method. All right, I want to talk a little bit about mattress encasements, and this one is a little different in that I wouldn't necessarily call it a treatment option because I definitely wouldn't use this option by itself from a treatment program. But I would say that mattress encasements can be another tool in the toolbox as a way to either be proactive or reactive for bedbug activity. And so what I mean by that is that these encasements are designed to be placed on and over the mattress and then zipped up, and some of them have special zip locking mechanisms. And the purpose of this device is to stop bedbugs from going into and out of the mattress. So it can be used proactively to stop bedbugs from getting into the mattress. And then in the case that if activity were to occur several months later, you could remove the encasement, launder it, and then save the mattress, knowing that it hasn't been impacted or affected by bedbugs. Some folks have elected to use these mattress encasements from a reactive standpoint, meaning if they have bedbug activity on a mattress, the mattress gets treated, and then the mattress gets encased with one of these. Now, the only caveat with that is that if there's a rip, tear, or hole later on, you could have some very hungry, angry bedbugs crawling out of that later, so that's something to consider. Some brands perform better than others, so there's a lot of different mattress encasements on the market. Some of them make some pretty strong claims, but there are some that are more durable, have better zip locking mechanisms than others, and if that's something you want some more information on, please reach out to your Ecolab representative. One thing I would say is do not use these on the box spring. As you can see in the picture on the bottom there, we've done some studies and looked at their durability, and we've just found that many of them do not hold up on the box spring, making it not a cost-effective tool for the box spring. But again, it can be used to protect the mattress. All right, another treatment option that you may have heard about out there is freeze treatments or steam treatments. So so for steam first, steamers can be used to kill bedbugs as long as you get direct contact. Once you get several inches away from the source or the furniture, or if you're unable to penetrate the heat through the furniture, or if it's thick foam like a mattress or a box spring, then it will become ineffective because, again, the lethal zone is really only within a few inches of the nozzle of that piece of equipment. It can be a very tedious, labor-intensive process, but it can be effective as long as you're getting contact on the bugs themselves. Similarly, there are freeze units out there that use frozen CO2 or dispense frozen CO2 in the same way as a steamer works, only it freezes the bedbugs. But again, direct contact is key there. So lastly, for a treatment option, I want to cover off on laundering. So with any type of clothing, bedding, linens, draperies, anything that can be washed, I would recommend washing that in hot water. In fact, temperatures over 140 degrees are preferred. Or those items can just be placed directly in the dryer. So rather, you can skip the wash cycle, go right to the dryer, and if you put those items right in the dryer, it takes only 15 to 30 minutes to be able to treat and kill any bedbug activity in those items. This can be a great method for, especially for more residential situations when you've got more personal belongings present. And in order to do a full treatment program of the room, those personal items will need to be addressed as well. And so that's where laundering can help with that. All right, let's talk just a couple of best practices in general here to consider. When selecting a pest management provider, make sure you're working with a provider that can offer that expertise, but also has the licensing and certification required to make those applications, especially when it comes to bedbugs because of the media attention that's going on and the liability that's out there. It's important to work with a reputable company that's licensed and certified and has experience, most importantly, experience in the situation, because bedbugs are a relatively new pest for the pest management industry, and you want to make sure you're working with somebody who knows what they're doing. Make sure they're offering consistent protocols and that they're eliminating pests, not just controlling pests. So that goes back to having steps in process to be more proactive. Again, you can't prevent bed bugs, but you can be definitely proactive about the situation. You want someone that can provide inspection, treatment, and most importantly, insights and recommendations for your team. Your pest provider should also be working with you in developing that partnership. With bed bugs, it's not an easy pest to eliminate. But with that partnership, it can become much easier. So make sure you're working with a pest provider that can offer you clear direction on what your responsibility is as a property manager versus their responsibility, and make sure that each step of the process is clear and each party understands what they need to do to make sure that we can eliminate the problem together. And just to show some additional tools that we have available here, from Ecolab, you can go to the ecolab.com bedbug toolkit site and find lots of information on how you can train your staff on what to look for, as far as fact sheets on what bed bugs are, what to look for, what to do. We have case studies and we have white paper available on there as well as we can provide additional on-site unit level education if requested. All right, and with that, I will turn it back to Melissa for the Q&A portion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Olson, for today's great presentation, learning all about bed bugs. So I would encourage any of the attendees online to continue submitting your questions through the Q&A panel. But we're just going to take a minute and look through these and answer a couple of your questions. All right, so Joelle, earlier you spoke about how bed bugs feed exclusively on blood and they prefer humans. One of the questions is, how do they detect human blood?
All right, so good question. And it ties in a little bit with how some of those monitoring devices are being developed today. Bed bugs utilize heat, CO2, and then some of the oily secretions that we have associated with our skin in order to detect the host. So it's understood that they actually use elevated levels of CO2 that activates them and gets them moving within a room. Heat pulls them in from shorter distances, and then those oils on your skin is really what triggers them to feed. So a little bit of a breakdown there for you, but I hope that answers the question.
Perfect, thank you. Let's take a look here. One of the other questions that we've received reads, are there different protocols for Ecolab depending on the industry? Bed bugs are serious, but most serious in the healthcare industry.
All right, yeah, so I would say the general process is the same, but I would say there are some different situations that we deal with when you're talking about a standard hotel room versus a long-term care facility. And really what that comes down to is the personal belongings. So we do have some best practices. So our general treatment protocols are similar, but our processes for dealing with personal belongings differs. There's also some best practices that we have associated with long-term care facilities, especially when considering that there are more, in general, there are more common areas, so lounges, entertainment areas, dining halls, areas in long-term care facilities that can become impacted by bed bugs, as well as there's a lot more different modes of transport, right? So you've got wheelchairs, walkers, canes, all of those items can carry bed bugs and transport them to other areas within the facility. So just to answer the question, I think our general approach is similar, but we have best practices associated with those different types of market segments.
Perfect. Thank you. So as you're speaking about the different types of market segments, one of the questions that came in is, what are some suggested best practices for dealing with bed bugs in multifamily apartment communities?
Right. So similar to long-term care facilities, when you're talking about multi-unit housing, you've got lots of personal belongings. You've also got maybe tenants that are sharing items, or maybe they're putting items out on the curb and those items are getting picked up and then brought into other apartments, which is causing the spread further of infestations. So those are some of the things that we consider. I would say with multi-unit housing, that's an area too where you could not only provide that proactive training, offer training to tenants, you may also want to consider having a tenant move in, move out type of procedure where you're helping inspect some of those items that they're bringing into your property, or maybe even offering a pre-treatment of those items before they come into the property as well. Monitoring devices may also be an option for multi-unit housing if you're trying to really understand or pinpoint where the problem is coming from. But in order to do that, it does require a widespread community effort as well. But that's something that you should work through in more details with your pest management provider.
Perfect, thank you. During today's presentation, one of the things that you stressed about in terms of being proactive is around having well-trained staff. So one of the questions that came in around staff is that my staff is concerned about going into rooms that have bed bugs. How can I get them to overcome their fears and still address their concerns? Or how can I protect my staff from potentially bringing bed bugs home?
Right, good question. I actually get this one quite a bit. I think especially providing that training so that you can alleviate those fears. So just talking to them about what bed bugs are, what to look for, what they do, but even taking it a step further. So as I mentioned, bed bugs don't fly, they don't jump. They're not actively seeking you out when you walk into that room. So if we're talking about a healthcare worker, a housekeeper, or even a social worker going into multi-unit family housing, they want to make sure that they're able to do their job, but also alleviate those concerns that those bed bugs aren't actively seeking them out. Bed bugs are more active at night when it's dark and it's quiet. They really don't want to have much to do with you during the day when there's people moving around and activity going on. So in that sense, you can alleviate some of the concerns that way. Another thing to think about is, like with bed bugs, with their eggs are actually adhered to a surface or glued to a surface, and they're glued and they stay there until they hatch. So the chances of picking up eggs is minimal as well. So I think just talking to your staff about some of those different aspects will help alleviate those concerns.
Thank you. And a couple more questions that I'm going to tie together here around the training and specifically around staff training. So one of the questions is, how can we train our housekeepers on doing more of an in-depth inspection for bed bugs, because just checking the piping doesn't seem to be enough, but also what types of staff training packages does Ecolab offer to businesses?
Okay, so yeah, great question. Especially in hotels, as I mentioned, most of the activity actually occurs on the box spring, the bed frame, or the bed skirt. So make sure you're not just talking to your staff about just inspecting the mattress. Now, if there is very limited time for your staff to be turning those rooms over, and that's the minimal that they can do is just inspect the mattress as they're doing their regular routine, that's okay. But if you want them to go a step further, I definitely would encourage them to inspect some of those other key areas like the box spring, bed skirt, and bed frame.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, and sorry, to that second question that you had, where can they find more additional information? Then I would recommend that they check out the bedbug toolkit on the ecolab.com website.
All right, thank you. We're just going to take a moment to look at some of the questions that are coming in. All right, so one of the questions is, what do you recommend to do with the rooms around the infected room? And I believe you spoke to this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, so I talked about the fact that bedbugs can move and migrate from one room to another. So anytime that you have a situation where there's bedbug activity in a room, you want to make sure that your pest provider is not only inspecting that infested room or suspected infested room, but they're also inspecting the adjacent rooms. And what I mean by that are the rooms above, below, and both sides. So our data suggests that those rooms are the ones most often impacted by the infestation. And so you want to make sure that you're inspecting those and kind of creating that circle of protection around the infested room. And as I mentioned, the primary infested room may actually be the room next to the originally, or the one that was reported on. So that's why it's important to get around those rooms as well. And in general, that's just an inspection and doesn't necessarily require a full treatment. So just making sure that those rooms are available and can be inspected by your pest management provider. If those rooms are occupied, we would just generally recommend that someone from your staff accompanies us along with that inspection if that's an occupied room.
Okay, so speaking about guest rooms, one of the questions is, if a room is occupied by a guest and turns out it is infested by bed bugs, should the guest move their personal belongings to the new room or leave the infested room and sent for dry cleaning? Or sometimes we know that we see facilities where they may state that there was an incident, the guest complains about an incident and they potentially request to be sent to another property. How do you handle, I think the question is, the personal belongings?
Right, so this is a sensitive area. You want to make sure that you're accommodating the guest. If they are reporting a sighting of a bed bug and they request another room, you want to make sure that you're accommodating them, moving them to another location. But I would say that it is very important that you have your pest management provider follow up with an inspection and possibly treatment of that new room that the person was moved to. Because again, unfortunately, we don't know if that person was just impacted by a situation that occurred in that room or if they've actually brought in the situation themselves with their belongings. So it's important to make sure that you're having your pest management provider inspect and treat the original location and the one that we moved to. As for personal belongings, as I mentioned, you can put those in the dryer for 15 to 30 minutes to kill any life stages that might be associated with their clothing or their personal belongings.
All right, we're going to take a moment and look through a couple more questions here as we near the end. One question that came in reads, is there any study on effect of water or soap water on bed bugs?
Yeah, so actually soapy water in general can be used to knock down live activity. And what that means is if you get a direct contact or you submerge an insect, even bed bugs or other insects in general, you can actually suffocate and kill them. However, as I mentioned, that's contact kill only, and that's not going to penetrate the cracks and crevices where bed bugs are likely to be harboring, and that's why it's really important to make sure that you've got a full treatment program in effect if there is a room suspected of having activity, because you're going to need multiple products, multiple active ingredients, multiple formulations that are going to actually reach those cracks and crevices, whereas soapy water alone won't do it, but it can provide contact, quick kill contact if you see something crawling across the floor, across the linens, for your staff to knock it down quickly, but it's not recommended as a treatment program.
Okay. A couple more questions here. One question is, how well do monitoring devices work for bed bugs compared to visual or canine inspections?
Great question. So I would actually suggest other inspection tools over some of these monitoring devices if you're using them as a proactive means. So what I mean by that is these monitoring devices, they make a little bit more sense when you use them after a treatment has occurred and you want to ensure that the bed bugs have been eliminated. They cannot be relied on alone as far as detecting whether bed bugs are present or not. Whereas on the flip side, a visual inspection by a pest management provider or even a canine inspection, those are tools that so far have held up in more difficult situations as a key mode of an inspection tool versus just the monitoring devices.
All right, perfect. Another question we have is, how prevalent are bed bugs in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so good question. I think a lot of areas in the world are experiencing the same type of resurgence that we're seeing here in the U.S. However, that being said, there are a lot of regions in the world that have been dealing with bed bugs for many, many years. so they've had them present, and they're not seeing the resurgence because they've always been there. So it just kind of varies across the world, and there really is no place to pinpoint where the problem has started or occurred or is getting worse versus one or the other. Bed bugs are definitely a global pest problem that needs to be addressed.
All right, we're going to look at a couple more questions before we close it out here today, so just give us one moment, please. All right, so as we see more pet-friendly hotels popping up, one of the questions is, if a dog was in the bedroom with no human, would the bed bugs feed off of that dog?
Yeah, so I mentioned, humans are their preferred host, but if starved and desperate, bed bugs will feed on other mammals. The challenge for them is that it's difficult for them to get through fur on dogs, cats, other types of domestic pets, and so that's pretty much why they generally don't prefer to feed on pets, but that they will if they're starved.
Okay, perfect. And I know earlier you had mentioned, bed bug bites, and sometimes, customers at facilities will come down and claim that they have bed bug bites or whatever. So one of the questions is it possible for a doctor to diagnose a bed bug bite just by looking at a person's bite?
Yeah, so no. The answer is no. There's no way to detect just by looking at the bite. And that's why it's so critical to make sure that if you have a guest in a situation like this where they have claimed to have gone to a doctor and have a note and all that, your responsibility as a property owner, property manager, is to make sure that you have that area inspected by a pest management provider. That documentation of their findings is going to be critical in that type of situation, and it will stand up as the main identification tool of whether or not there's activity present. You just can't look at the bites alone.
Okay, perfect. And our final question, before we close with a few remarks, is around, is the bed bug problem going to continue to increase?
So that's a really good question. As far as what we've seen, or what I've experienced over the last 15 years, is that this is a gradually increasing pest problem for our industry. We have not seen it slow down. What's interesting is that bed bug activity does correlate with occupancy rates around the world. So as occupancy rates are increasing, we see bed bug activity increasing. And really that's just because as more people are moving around and they're moving bed bugs around, the problem is going to continue to increase. So I don't see this slowing down anytime soon, but I do think the more we educate not only our customers, but the more we educate the general public on this topic, I think it will start to get better control over the situation. But I do see it increasing. Perfect.
Well, Dr. Joelle Olson, I'd like to thank you for all the great information today on bed bugs. For all of those attendees out there, I'd like to remind you that a recording of today's webinar will be available on ecolab.com later this week on our bed bug page. I'd also encourage you all to check out the bed bug toolkit page because we do have a lot of great training tools out there, and we also do offer some bilingual materials. So if you do not find them online, feel free to reach out to your Ecolab representative. And I thank you for your time today, and have a wonderful afternoon.